Hello, everyone, and welcome to another of Cohere's podcast from the series, Are We Listening? This is the 6th podcast in our series, and I'm very happy to welcome Foni Joyce Vuni as our guest today. Foni, hi, how are you?
Hi, Ed. Really a pleasure to be here. I'm doing quite well.
Great. Thanks so much for joining and for agreeing to talk to us today. And we could start, as we usually do, by asking you to introduce yourself, talk a bit about your background, your life, anything you think we'd love to hear today would be interesting. So yeah, start right from the beginning if you like.
Where do I start? So many things to be shared from my perspective. Foni Joyce is my name, South Sudanese. I was born a South Sudanese. My parents came to Kenya back in the 1990s, 1991. I was born in Kenya, basically, lived my life in Kenya. But when my parents came to Kenya, I inherited the displaced status, and that has been sort of like part of my identity for the longest time. So many things I could say. Maybe I'll just keep it very brief in terms of my educational background. I've studied in Nairobi, did all my primary levels up until my tertiary levels in Nairobi. Many of my friends tell me I sound very Kenyan. I don't sound South Sudanese. I've inherited that accent. So don't worry about that. But generally, my parents, basically both my mom and my dad, have really influenced the sort of work I do. In terms of my profession, I'm a researcher. I also work within the space of development, international development, but majorly also looking at how do we basically lobby around issues to do with refugees, refugee participation, refugee education, and inclusion in itself. I think for me, the people who majorly influenced the path that I ended up taking and the work that I'm currently doing are my parents. So my dad was a journalist, did a lot of reporting around issues that were happening in South Sudan, as well as was quite involved in the peace process, or get sort of like that whole peace process, separation from Sudan as well. So he was quite involved in that. And I remember he would occasionally give me tasks to do, report on this, write on this, tell me what is happening, attend an event, come and tell me who said what. Initially, I thought it was quite a lot. I just wanted to be a child. But I think that really helped shape me in terms of looking at how do you attend an event, what is being said around the people who are concerned. And then on the other end, there's my amazing mother as well, who is a community developer. So when she came to Nairobi, in terms of her educational background, she had not accessed education, but she had learned a lot of skills which were quite vital in terms of the work that she does right now as a community worker, as a community developer. She worked with women from across different walks of life, different ethnicity. And our home, as we were growing up, essentially was a hub of multiple personalities and people coming in. So we'd see colleagues that my dad works with, we'd see colleagues that my mom works with. And when I realized I was displaced, because I don't think during my younger ages I knew I was displaced. It was something that I gradually came to understand through educational system, through looking at how the treatment was happening between people who were perceived foreigners. And when we sat down and had that conversation, I think they were able to really tell us, look, this is not your home. You're actually from Sudan. By that time, it was still Sudan. And we're here because of ABCD. So they really broke it down. And for me, that then set out this whole trajectory of what I wanted to do and what I wanted to become. Because I had seen, for instance, how discrimination was happening even as we were children, how people were being sidelined. And I felt, well, if there's one thing I can do, possibly is change the narrative around refugees and displaced people. So what do I do? And I was like, I'm going to set out and do multiple things that proves a different point that we're not just here to occupy space. We're not just here because of wanting to be here. It was a situation that led to this. However, that doesn't take away from us needing dignity and also being able to contribute. And that essentially led me to this space I work in, where I work with refugee youth across the globe. I've worked in research, multiple jacks of trade, I would say, on multiple aspects, but my key areas is youth, inclusion, women, and then education and peace building. Those are sort of like the key things that I see have a lot of intersectionality in my work.
Wow, yes, I can absolutely see the influence of both your parents in your career. And we'll come on to your work at the Global Refugee Youth Network. But I think the first time I met you was around 2015 when you just graduated from Kenyatta University. I believe you were studying communications, is that right?
Yes, I was actually doing communication.
Yeah, I seem to remember that because I think even then you gave a speech to our secondary school students that we were supporting at the time through secondary school in urban areas of Kenya. And I remember you explaining why you'd gone into communications that even back then, this is now 10 years ago, was focused on telling a different story for your community. And I think the other reason we knew about you is because did you score the highest grade in the whole cohort or something? You got a very high grade that year. Yeah. So
Yeah.
is that correct that you chose, I mean, it seems like you're quite influenced by your father's career at that point in terms of choosing communications to study. Did you ever think you might follow in his footsteps of journalism?
Well, it's interesting that we're actually having this conversation 10 years since we last met, and a lot of things has changed. I think initially when I took communication, I sort of like wanted to do communication and really express myself, express the community needs. And I was trying to combine what I had seen my father do. My father was really involved in print media, writing articles, writing journals, and all those other things. And then I would see my mom doing something totally different, which was speaking. So I was like, it would be so cool to combine the two and then be able to just speak. And then the path that I ended up choosing was public relation. I felt that was a good place to actually do public relation, but in terms of refugee communities, because most of the people would do public relation, it was either to fix images or within an organization, set strategies. And when I chose that, I think I was heavily influenced by my dad, the work that he did. And then the work that my mom was doing as well was giving it the human touch aspect of it, really looking at what does it mean in practical when you're working on in the ground. Because even with journalism, it has all these principles of what you can do, what you cannot do. And then there's the reality of what do you actually do in a situation when you encounter it. And I was living that through my mom's eyes. So I feel those two really influenced me a lot. And then I think linking it to education was I felt like when I was young, I felt, well, you know what, just being displaced is not going to dictate what you end up doing in life. But maybe because you're in this space, occupy the space. If you're in school, do best, possibly the best you could do. And I think that was one of the motivators that I had at that particular point when I was doing my undergrad as well. I was sort of like looking at how do you set an example for young girls, young women, and also my sisters, because we're a house full of young women. And for me, it felt like, how do I set an example for them to know that the displacement aspect of it is one of it, but you can still move beyond it and do a bit much more, and you can do much more even within displacement as well. So it was multiple reasons, but I think majorly I also wanted to talk when I took that course as well.
Right. And soon after that, I know that the Global Refugee Youth Network, you've actually been working with that for quite a long time, because did that come out of a previous initiative and sort of rebranded? And I seem to remember it. Was it embedded within something else and then it became its own entity later on?
So with the Global Refugee Youth Network, I would say where we are right now is based on a couple of other progress and initiatives that have existed since 2015. Because I remember right when I was in campus, before I finished my campus, we were engaging in something called the Global Refugee Youth Consultation. And this consultation in particular was brought about by different actors. We had UNHCR, Women Refugee Commission, multiple other partners. We really wanted to understand what were some of the challenges that young people were facing in their communities. And as a result of that, we had about 22 consultations globally, and it had about over 1,000 young people globally engaging in it, speaking around the issues, the challenges that they were facing. Then in the lead up to that, what ended up coming out of that was some frameworks in terms of how do you work with young refugees. We refer to it as the coactions for refugee youth, basically breaking down what are some of the priorities for young people globally, and then what is the role of young people in achieving these priorities, what are the roles of UN agencies, international organizations, governments, in really also supporting young people. So as a result of that, one particular recommendation that we had there was to have UNHCR set an advisory board. And this advisory board would work with UNHCR and its implementing partners to basically share and reflect back on its programming on what young people are saying is important and what is a priority for the young people. So this specific council was set with an interim group of 12 of us. It was supposed to be a rotational sort of like engagement. We were about 12 of us, worked in that advisory council, which coincided almost at the same time with the drafting process of the Global Compact on Refugees. So then that led us to really engage in that process, feed into that whole process of the drafting, share what is the priority for their community, what communities feels are a priority. And I think I worked in that specific space for about close to 3 years. But then since the structure or the structure that we had set was that it was going to be rotational, it meant that at some point I'd have to leave. So it got to a point then we had to leave and other young people would then come back in and continue the work. How then Global Refugee Youth came to its fruition then was because COVID happened. And when COVID happened, as much as I was out of the council, we were still engaging with other young people locally as well as regionally through other networks that I was also part of. So we did a very simple survey and asked young people, what is a priority for you all right now? Because the coactions that we had lasted for a couple of years. And we wanted to check if it was still relevant, even to continue advocating based on this framework, or do we need to do something a bit more? So at that particular point, we ended up conducting a survey and asked other young people, what is a priority for you? What do you feel needs to change? And the feedback was that as they were responding to COVID within their communities, there were a couple of things that they realized was a huge challenge. One, they didn't have funding to respond or to conduct activities they were doing. Two, they still needed capacity as well. And then three, for some of them, there was also the question of evidence. How do we capture evidence as we're doing this? So together with some of the alumni who were part of the UNHCR Global Youth Advisory Council, we came together and we took all the feedback that we had gotten from different regions. This is from Africa, the MENA region, Asia Pacific as well. And we took all this specific feedback and looked at it and said, what can we do to help young people to localize the response that they're giving? And that's how then Global Refugee Youth came to being, where our work focuses on 3 key areas. One, looking at strengthening refugee leadership. This could be either through providing I would say seed grants to help them actualize activities they're doing in their community, or even supporting young people who are not necessarily part of a group to be able to conduct advocacy. The second part of it is our foundation, which is advocacy. So really looking at how do we influence discussions or decisions about refugees, particularly young people, by being there, by being present from the start to the end. And then lastly, looking at how do we work to generate evidence that young people can use in their advocacy, or evidence that we can also share back in terms of this is why the community is saying this is important, and this is the proof that communities are saying this is important. So that's sort of like the quick, very brief overview of how Green came to being. But I would say that Green's work is really building upon other engagements that we've been part of, that the different leadership have been part of, the UNHCR Global Youth Advisory Council. We have the Tertiary Refugee Student Network, TRSN, as well as other entities or different groups that we've all been part of at different stages of our lives as well.
Fascinating. Yeah. So I'd love to ask a few more specific details about the work you do at GRIN, and then also some of the challenges that you face. You talk about the seed grants for strengthening refugee leadership. Is that mostly giving grants to refugee-led organizations that are run by young people? And maybe you could tell us a bit more about what that looks like.
So the seed grant that we have, for example, is really for young refugees. We work with young people generally, and how this is structured or how it works basically is we've designed an application process where young people are able then to apply for the seed funding. However, this is also embedded in working with them to think about project design. How do you actually design a project? How do you implement a project, and how do you also capture information not only for yourself but also for the community that you're working with, and also to share globally or within the parameters of where you're implementing. So the way we've designed it is in such a way, what we're trying to achieve with this specific fund, which is the Youth Action Fund, is really realizing that we need to meet young people where they are in terms of their leadership, in terms of their advocacy, and also in terms of how they're responding to their community. So one of the key parameters that we really look at when it comes to this specific fund, we look at the context, because contexts are very different. One criteria will not fit all the different contexts. So it means that you have to look at how do you even select some of the projects? How do you even work with them? How do you prioritize the activities that the young people are doing? Of course, we'd like to take all of them, but sometimes, of course, funding is also limited. You can only do so much with a little bit of funding. And then the second thing that is quite key as well as a criteria is also looking at the project, not in terms of this is a project that is going to be sustainable for a very long period. One thing that we've realized is that the projects take different natures. There are projects that are projects which are responding to a very immediate need. And then there are projects that have been, or groups rather, that have existed for such a long time, and they're running a specific program. Then the funding itself is going to target that specific program. And then we have projects that will be sustainable. So I think for us, it's also been the nature of looking at each project individually and not looking at it collectively and saying all these projects are going to be sustainable for the next 10 years or 50 years, hypothetically speaking. It's really just looking at what are the young people doing and how can we come in to support what you're doing. Of course, if the funding itself is not that funding that guarantees long-term implementation, but what we do is we try and see where you are, and then we work with you to implement what you have at the moment, with the hopes that even as you prepare for other funding initiatives, you'd at least have set up some parameters that can also help you. And I think the last thing that is quite key for us is that either you're registered or not registered, we still work with you. We try and see where you are and define success based on the groups. We call them RILOs, which are Refugee Youth-Led Organization. We define success based on what they also feel is a success for them and their community, instead of coming with a lot of unrealistic guidelines that would be very hectic for a group that, a perfect example, we had a group of young people who were about 15 to 17 year old. And for them, they felt that as young people, one of the things that we don't have is a space to hang out. We just want to actually come together, sit down and just talk, because that can also help our mental health. And for them, they felt that they just wanted support to be able to facilitate such an arrangement where it's us just sitting together as adolescents and talking about our feelings or the challenges we're facing. And for another group, they just wanted to have sport gears to play football because that makes them happy, or it also guarantees that it goes back to their well-being. So then the question is, when you have such a group and then you have a group that has a very structured activities and programs they want to implement, how do you come in and support them and fund all those different activities? Because they're all important at the end of the day. So the approach that we have embedded in all groups that we work with is really about meeting them where they are. If it's young children or young adolescents who actually are saying, we don't have a space to play, we don't have gears, then how can you work with them to provide these gears? Or if it's a group that is implementing quite complex programs, or for lack of better word, how do you come in to support part of that programming as well? So it's different from one context to another. Challenges that have come up, of course, a lot of groups. We have so many groups who are doing amazing work, but funding is limited. That's one thing. And then secondly, I'd say as much as we want to make it flexible, fast, sometimes you still encounter bureaucracy. So that also still comes into play depending on the different contexts that you're working in as well.
Yeah, as Cohere, we also work with organizations that are not registered. It's fascinating to hear your experiences with that, because for most donors and even intermediaries we come across, the assumption is that it's just not possible. You've given some hints there as to how you do it, but I think one of the ideas might be providing gifts in kind, like the soccer jerseys and kits, and the room. Maybe you support them with the room for the adolescents to meet. But what other strategies do you have to work with organizations that are not registered and just simply can't provide the levels of due diligence that most donors would need, or the bureaucracy that many of your funding sources are going to be looking for?
That's an interesting conversation, right? Because I think one of the things that we've really been looking at also as Green, we are a refugee youth-led organization, right? And the funding that, for instance, that we would apply for will still have a lot of the reporting, a lot of criteria that needs to be met. But one thing that we've also looked at is, I think when we were starting this, we wanted to do a proof of concept, where we sort of like would say, these are some of the groups we want to work with, and this is why it's important to work with them. And the first thing that we ended up doing before we even went to the donors was to start with that whole aspect of going back to the young people and asking, how do we do this? How do we do this in a practicality? How do we, if it's transferring of funds, for example, how do we do this? What works in your context? And then the second thing was also having an ally, or rather going into a partnership with an organization that readily agreed to also work with us. So we partnered with the Women Refugee Commission, who essentially also helped us to do the work that we're doing, and also to help us put together some good checks and balances in terms of how are you going to be accountable to your donor? What do you need to take into account when you're doing this? So that has been one of the key things that has really helped us to look at, as much as Green is also a refugee-led organization that has to go through this, then how do we make this process much more lighter and simpler for some organization who have existed for different intervals? Because when we came into the ground and we were working with the different groups, we saw that there were different spectrum of refugee-led organizations that youth are working in. There are those ones that have existed for 6 months, for example, There are others who might have existed for over 2 years, and there are others who've existed for over 5 years. So looking at each one of them needed us to think about how do we approach compliance in a way that helps the RILOs or the refugee-led organization to build capacity, whilst also making sure as Green, who is also within that particular spectrum, we're able to meet the donor requirements. So this meant that, one, we needed to build trust, because approaching a donor and saying that we're going to actually fund groups which are not registered, the first reaction was sort of like, well, how is that going to be possible? How are you going to make sure that for every there's accountability for all the funds that would be used? So we tried to really prove the concept with the donors in terms of when we're doing this, we'd actually transfer funds. We work with the RILO, there's capacity building, there's engagement throughout the whole implementation period, not in a micromanagement way, but in a way that helps the groups to also build their capacity. And we did get donors who were very trusting. And I think that's the most important thing, right? Where the donor trusted that refugee youth who are in the midst of the challenges that they're facing have come up with a solution. Let's actually trust that they would actually do this and implement and work in their community. So when we started this, we started with about 22 groups. I remember that was the first number. We started with 22 groups and we worked with them to build the system. And the system we were building was on how do we report back? How do we capture information? What is a priority? What do you need to do? So we really worked on defining with the community what essentially is important when it comes to reporting back. And instead of asking them, or how many people did you reach? What was the percentage of people involved? Can you provide quantitative format? We needed to shift it in terms of realizing that even with some of them, meeting them where they are, it meant that there's no way you can ask a young person who maybe has not engaged with any quantitative type of reporting to report extensively based on that. Because what we realized was, as they were implementing, then what would have been missed is if they have a meeting, for example, I think 2 different examples. I remember in one particular group, they talked about, we had our meeting and we saw girls speaking up at this community meeting. Or we had a meeting and we were working with children, encouraging them to go to school. And for some of them, after joining our group, they've been attending school. So we really needed to look at, this is the quantitative or the qualitative aspect that donors would want us to report on. But the reality was that we needed to have a qualitative shift and look at some of the stories that they're sharing from the ground, which often would not show up in a log frame, but they're almost at the center of the heart of change. Because if we just focused on that, then we would have to ask, why do the numbers carry more weight than the narratives, And then the success stories or the implementation that they were working on would only be approved or would only be valid if they fit a specific template. So we tried to have the workshops that we were using or the mini workshops that we were running as a way to help the young people to also see, as you're implementing, these are some of the areas that you can look at. These are some of the things that you can focus on, or some of the areas you can incorporate into implementation, because it'll help you to show much more of what you're doing as compared to just saying, yes, we were targeting 20 people, then we've worked with 20 people. So we wanted to go a bit beyond, then show that the success is being defined from the perspective of the community and what is working rather than what templates we put together. So the templates are supposed to help you, but also realizing that in some context, connectivity is an issue. So if someone is supposed to share a budget, do we need them to share a budget in our template, or do we create a flexible system of saying, take a pen and a paper, then write out what you want to do, take a picture, that should suffice in terms of what you want to do. So really also adjusting the criteria of what traditional donors would want to actually the realities of where some of the young people are based. So that's some practical example I could share of how we've tried to navigate all the different requirements that donors would have, but then at the same time also as Green taking on some of those heavy requirements and pushing back as well. I think because it's also important that we push back and say, you're asking us to provide maybe a 20-page application, but in reality, it's very impossible for a group to do that if you're not realizing the reality of where they are in terms of the implementation, in terms of also the number of years they've existed or the work that they're doing as well. So also using it as an advocacy point for us and the donors.
Yeah, exactly. And has that had any luck? Would you say the pushback is being well received?
I think the pushback, I'd say it's relative, right? Where it's being received in some areas. In some areas, you'll encounter both, where in some places it's being received, in some places it's not being received well. You'd have to still conform. But I think if we're looking at the whole aspect on what needs to happen, even when we're talking about the engagement with donors, I think there's been a shift. I'd say there's actually been a shift, and there's been a couple of donors, multiple donors who are open enough to really talk about the uncomfortable truth around what even participation looks like, yeah? Because of late, the last maybe 5 years, there's been quite a lot of change in terms of participation. How does it look like? How do we bring RLOs into the space? How do we engage with RLOs? And initially, when I began my work, I generally felt that in many donor-led spaces, participation was marked as inclusion, but in reality, it was very tokenistic, where we just had, oh yeah, there were people here, and then they engaged. But I feel the change is happening, and in some of these spaces, as we're pushing back, as donors are also learning, we're slowly seeing that even if you're invited to the room, before you were invited in the room, and then the agenda criteria, funding framework has already been set. And then this would be referred to, co-creation. And then communities then would be asked, can you provide input? Can you share what you think about it? But the reality is we don't control that. Or sometimes we would not even understand what was being said because the language, the timelines, and there was also a lot of jargon that was being used. However, as much as this is still a reality in many contexts, there's also progress that has been made with other donors taking a step back and asking themselves, is this co-creation, or is this a validation of what we want to do? Because I think that aspect of it is something that needs to happen a bit more. It's happening. I wouldn't say it's not totally happening. It's happening, but then we need more of that so that we move from the disconnect of short-term funding and the way it's structured and the quick results that people want to see, which are not necessarily transformational. And how we do this, we need to actually build trust. It takes time, We can't build trust. We can't shift norms in terms of gender or youth empowerment in just 1 or a few months. It has to take time. And if each group or if each refugee-led organization is looking at, these are the requirements that the donor has put, this is what we need to do, this is what is only available, then what we end up creating is this sense of competition between groups, which is not necessarily collaboration. So I think that whole aspect of changing how donor works has to start from that aspect of power balance, which is quite key, and issues of access. So we have new groups, we have groups that have existed for long, we have groups that are almost sort of like in the middle, and all of them are close to the community, and each one of them struggles to access funding differently. So also understanding this different reality is quite important to help us really look at how can we change this to be meaningful and not just another implementation that we need to report back on?
Yeah, I could. So many things I could follow up in what you just said, and I think so many phrases from there, particularly like what you're saying about trust and about communities framing what success looks like. I also very much identify with what you've said about representation and participation stepping in for actual inclusion. And I think maybe, I mean, you were working on advocacy around the time of the Global Compact, and a similar time just before that with the World Humanitarian Summit, with the target of channeling 25% of funding to local and national actors, really meant that the focus was immediately going to be on identity and representation, as opposed to inclusive ways for everyone in the community to have a say over their own future. And an example from what you're talking about could be that still within the shifting power movement, particularly when it comes to refugee leadership, the end goal is still imagined by many as being getting funds to refugee leaders. And what you've been trying to advocate for almost 10 years is, well, what about other levels of marginalization within community leadership and refugee leadership? Because if we only focus on refugee leaders as having power and having funding as the only form of success, then what's likely to happen, and this clearly has been happening, is that relatively young men who are pretty literate, especially in English, are going to be leading those organizations. And that isn't necessarily inclusive. It doesn't automatically mean that the most marginalized in the community have agency and decision-making over what happens in their lives. And I really agree with what you've been saying about the only way to really get around this is because if you don't use human relationships and trust, then there's no way to avoid the process of paperwork and bureaucracy-based due diligence. And in the end, that form of selection will end up being exclusionary and biased towards people who are more literate in those expectations, basically people who speak the donor language.
Mm-hmm. Which is very true, because I'm just also reflecting and thinking about what you're referring to, how some of the most marginalized are left out. I think in our work with Green as well, what we've seen, especially for young women, I remember in one instance, one of the young women came and they're like, well, you have these documents that we need to apply for this funding, but in reality, we are scared of this document. We can't really fill it out. So that meant that we had to change our strategy to also build confidence and also acknowledge that all of us have different levels of education, different levels of understanding, different levels of even engaging in spaces that we're in. And it takes time. I won't lie. It takes so much time to be able to work with others, to help them to feel confident enough, to help them to feel ready to actually maybe even fill a document. Because it's very easy to say our template is it's very youth friendly. It's using the simplest language, but it can also be very overwhelming for someone who has no laptop and they can't even work on a laptop. You have a Google Doc. How are they supposed to work on this? Or someone who has no access at all in terms of even movement from where they are to a location where they can sit down and fill it in, it becomes very complicated. So this meant that even for how we were engaging with the young people, it meant that we would need to go a step further and use some of the tools that young people are using. Where do you find young people? If they're on WhatsApp, it has meant working with them on WhatsApp. It's meant having interviews on WhatsApp. It's meant asking them, this is the document, this is what we're asking. It's meant interpreting documents in multiple languages, Swahili, English, French, Arabic, multiple languages, so that they're able then to have access. Because if there's no access, then it's still a huge challenge. And then we end up missing some of the key people who we would need maybe to also include themselves. I mean, we look at the refugee-led organizations and where it is right now, we have a lot of progress we've made with refugee-led organization, but at the same time, we're still missing a lot of women in leadership. And this is also due to multiple factors that if we're not cognizant enough to realize that the RLOs that are visible might have women, but what about the women who are in RLOs or have small RLOs, but in a remote location? How do we get them? So I think it's very important that as we're thinking about the shifts, about community-led shifts or localization itself, we have to ask ourselves those bold questions. What are we not doing that is making us miss some of the other marginalized groups, even within the displacement context that typically would be missed if we don't plan intentionally and if we're not actually working with the community more intentionally as well. So those for me have been some of the things that I keep on saying that are coming up at in different contexts as well, which is a learning for us as well as Green too.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of blind spots, collectively as a sector, even within the sort of localization movement, as it were. You were talking earlier about co-creation. I've recently been peer reviewing a set of applications for initiatives that are supposed to be embedded within the community, but most of the innovators of the applications I was reviewing were actually from outside of the communities. And some did mention co-creation, but I think what frustrated me was that actually it's so obviously tokenistic and maybe even insulting when you look at the budget proposals. How much of the budget is ever going to be controlled, like really controlled by the community versus by the external experts who are coming in to deliver something for that community that they believe, based on very flimsy frameworks of research and assumptions about what people want different in their lives, they believe is a very good intervention. And in many of the applications, you're looking at 5% of the funds that the community would really have control over. I mean, the vast majority would be going towards the salaries of the external experts. That was the largest thing. Travel and logistics, consultancies, big meetings with the community to try and get their approval, of which, yes, some of them, the community members might benefit. And then very, very little would go to, for example, community volunteers, facilitators. And sadly, there was almost zero mention of subgranting to locally led organizations so that they could actually have control over the resources. So despite this, there's still, for the few donors who do talk about, okay, let's really shift resources to communities and give them the flexibility, like you're describing. And this is what we hope we do at Cohere as well. But still, there's this assumption even from the more open-minded donors that it's just a matter of time before these local, particularly organizations led by marginalized groups like youth, people with disabilities, women in remote areas, for example, that we might be able to be flexible for them now, but really what they need to do is they need to increase their capacity and they need to basically learn to speak the donor language. They need to learn how to generate evidence. They need to learn how to report and we should allocate a significant amount of funding towards that because that's going to be in their better interest. They'll raise more funds in the future and it will basically make them look more like a small NGO. So that's something that frustrates me, is that there's still this assumption that it's the community organizations that need to more speak the donor language than the other way around. And also, I still unfortunately see intermediaries more very happy to be talking about we need capacity strengthening for local organizations rather than like what you're describing is 60-70% of the advocacy and the capacity strengthening really needs to be targeted at the donors to be more open-minded about what what it means for communities to make decisions over their own futures, but also therefore control the resources and also control the accountability and the frame of success, and not for donors themselves to have to be able to own the narrative of what changes and therefore be able to claim credit for those changes. Interested in your reflections on this, and then I've got some questions about the research side of it, because that's been a part of your career as well. But yeah, does any of this prompt? I can see you're ready to respond.
Because just thinking about what you've said, Ed, and it's always made out to seem as if the problem is that communities are not ready, communities don't have system. But the question, or my response to this, has always been, what if it's the guidelines that donors are providing are the problem, Because we also have to actually challenge the status quo assumptions, as you've mentioned, on what guidelines is being provided, what counts as accountability, and how we define impact. And if we need to shift power, if we need to have this conversation, then donors would need to be very bold enough and actually ask themselves these questions in terms of, we set these guidelines, but is this guideline something that is going to work with the communities? They need to be flexible enough to realize that these guidelines are very different. You can't implement these guidelines in some context, which is very impossible to even work with. But the truth is, not everyone is comfortable with asking these tough questions of, are we actually doing this for the community, or are we already just setting an agenda? We have an agenda to fulfill. We've already set the agenda, and then we need people to work with us to fulfill this agenda. I know everyone has an agenda, right? Everyone has an agenda. They want to implement, they have their KPIs, they have existing frameworks. But being bold is actually challenging that status quo and looking at the deeper issue here, which is that some of the systems, even with the donors, were not built with the community in mind. And there's need to propose new ways of working, of doing things in a way that resists the system that has been there, and it's not working. And what the community basically is saying is that, give us that opportunity to actually not just sit at the table, but also shape how this table looks like. Because I think that's the other conversation. I know early on in my advocacy, I was fighting for, yes, we need a seat at the table, but actually what we need is to shape how that table looks itself. And there's no way this table can be shaped if there's tough questions are not being asked, or if there's no access to ask these tough questions as well. So I think what you're reflecting on is quite true as well, in terms of what needs to happen a bit more and in a very fast, locally directed way as well.
Yeah, one of the debates we've been having internally at Cohere, I'm really interested in your thoughts on this, is the question of, to what extent what level of agenda owned by a donor is appropriate. And let me explain what I mean by using some examples. I'm going to speak very fondly of what a donor that has funded us in the past, the Lego Foundation. And they were, by the way, a great donor, very flexible, and we're able to give pretty much fully unrestricted grants to our RLO partners with that funding. Their agenda is learn through play, and they always have a play-based element in their funding. So you could ask, is that appropriate? How far is that appropriate when Lego as a company is all about play and learning through play? And so what I'm interested in is it appropriate for a donor to angle their funding towards a certain vision? Because you could have a vision of saying, we really would like millions of children around the world to have an experience of play in their childhood and learning through play. Maybe that is appropriate. And then you could similarly, give other examples. I know that, for example, IKEA Foundation generally focused on livelihoods and the environment, which makes sense for IKEA. There's an overlap there with in terms of their work as a company. It's a nice balancing element being a furniture company, which is very intertwined with livelihoods and the environment. And then, you could actually look at many of the different foundations. You could see similar things, even MasterCard Foundation with jobs and access to finance, And we know these foundations are legally separate from their brand, but at the same time, is it appropriate for a donor to have some level of vision for a different future? And if they are, then at what point does that vision become too specific to the extent that it limits the agency and freedom of communities to actually decide their priorities? And maybe, to give another example, we're doing a lot of work with RLOs in Eastern Congo at the moment, where crises range from the immediate effects of violence, from everything from rape to, violent displacement, but also the secondary effects of cholera, malnutrition, flooding, fires in refugee camps. And unfortunately, however amazing the programs may sound in terms of learning through play or environment and livelihoods and access to finance, a community may at a certain point just have a priority that they desperately want to focus on. And that might be understandable. Now, as I say, most of the donors I've mentioned there also build into their strategies some flexibility to those kind of crises, but not all donors do. Other donors will say, well, no, our funds are for building classrooms. And if you're not going to build a classroom, then you need to give us back the money. So that's the question. At what point is it appropriate for a donor to have an element of an agenda or to own some vision to change?
Definitely a very huge question, right? And breaking it down, that's sort of like something we'd need to have a whole session on and have a discussion on it. I think the reality is that donors will have their own priorities on what they want to focus on. And unfortunately, we can influence some, and we can also not influence others. But I would look at it as, if we're talking about different donors have different aims or different things that they want to focus on. But if we're going to the community, we're already coming with a finished product. And what we're asking for is implementation. Then I would assume that the donors have to be very clear and transparent and tell the community that this is what we're aiming to achieve and this is how we want you to help us to achieve it. One, there has to be transparency. Because what I've seen happening, if donors already have their own priorities that they're focusing on, then what ends up happening is that even within communities, there's tendency to change the focus of what is important to be able to access this funding. That's one. And then secondly, I think it's also a question of, in some community aspect, you'll find that that's not the priority. And if that's not the priority, you come with your own agenda, implementing it in that community, there'll never be a proper uptake of what is being implemented. It's just going to be another activity that was implemented, but in reality, that was not something that we needed or that's something that we wanted at that particular point. One example a colleague of mine shared with me is that in their location, they really needed skills, different types of skill, but because of donor priority, what was being given to them at that particular point was livelihood skills. And what they were being taught at that particular point was, let's say, making soap. So for them, every single person learned how to make soap. And then there was the market. Who do you sell soap to if everyone can make soap? So the question is, sometimes we have our priorities even as donors, but the reality is that this might not be something that is needed. However, there's also space whereby if a donor is focusing, for example, on child play, then we need to look at it as what else is it contributing to? Because I would assume, for instance, if a child's well-being, if a child is able to play, then the well-being of the child is going to be quite good. And then at the same time, the child is able to engage in foundational learning in school just because they've been able to be a child, they've been able to engage, they've been able to play. So how then do we take an intersectional lens also as donors who have different priorities to look at if this is what we're prioritizing, how does it fit with the priority of the community? Because what has been happening, it's more so that we have the money, of course, you have the money, that resources that we need to use for implementation, and we need to implement. But with that precondition already, you're telling us, I have the money, I'll only implement on this. But in reality, what if in that community, there's already play that is happening, and what needs to be strengthened a bit more is access to mental health services for the children to deal with trauma. So it's give or take, where I feel sometimes donors can have their own areas and implement, which is okay, and support specific activities. But there has to be an intersectional lens that looks at the reality of the community and what the community is saying. Because if we don't do that, what we end up having at the end of this implementation is the community feeling whether this particular area has been overly invested in, that it's not addressed one other particular area. So I feel having an intersectional lens in terms of approaching the community, intersectional lens in terms of looking at what the community is doing would be a good way that helps us to have a proper balance where community voices are truly listened to without preset goal, and the donor work that they're focusing on is also sort of like looked at. I think we need a win-win sort of scenario, because what we've been having is sort of like a win, and in one end, conformity. People have been conforming, but for how long will they conform? And the reality is, one day, within even the displacement spectrum, some people go back, some people integrate, some people are not able to go back. So how does it contribute to that end goal of dignity that each person is also looking for individually as well as for their community? So I think it's give or take. I wouldn't have like a straight answer of saying, no, we have to do this. I think approaching each context by context and looking at the role of the community in setting their own agenda is the most important thing on how then we have a finished product, and not just coming with something that is already preset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the other, I agree. I think one of my fears is that if you really tell all donors don't have any thematic interest, then possibly people just give less money, because, I mean, I could be accused of being a hypocrite, because for Cohere, we also have a thematic focus of people affected by forced displacement. And someone who doesn't fit in that category at all might say that is, that's owning the agenda, and that might be fair. So I think in the end, if you take out any interest from those who have resources and just say it's not appropriate for you to have any interest as to how your funds are spent, that people might possibly just not give, because you need that emotional, but also you need that sense of hope, fortunately, as one of the drivers of probably choosing to give. And since our state donors are sleeping on the job and pulling out funding, then it now depends on people all around the world if we're going to create more fair distribution of resources that include the most marginalized, then people are going to have to choose to give. But I agree with you. I think there has to be a balance where really anyone with resources being able to reflect on the privileges that you have, to recognize that your vision for a better future might not be the only one, and that just because you want to see, 1 million girls go to school, it might sound great, but maybe those communities define success in slightly different ways, and the end result might be very similar. And I'd like to just, as a last topic, steer the conversation towards evidence and research, because when I hear the word evidence and research, because of the connotations that come with those ideas, I'm mainly thinking of products that are going to be consumed by people from outside the community, like some kind of research report. Because if it's learning and that's really 100% focused on the community, it's probably not described as research anyway. It's just, there'll be different ways of talking about how information is shared if it's not of interest to outsiders. So I sometimes feel that we're trying to prove a point about what communities are doing. And in some cases, there's this hypothesis that communities know what they need, and here's evidence to prove it. Refugee-led organizations are achieving great impact, and here's the evidence to prove it. So my question is, why do we need that evidence? Isn't it a bit patronizing to even question that the community wouldn't know what's best, for themselves? And so, I mean, it would be fine, except that there's so many resources, so much funding put into building this bank of evidence to prove that communities can make the right decisions for themselves. And I just wonder why we need to even ask that.
Funny enough, with research, I look at research in two ways, right? I know we're talking about evidence from the community perspective, but I'm also looking at it from knowledge production from the community perspective, right? And it's actually challenging what is considered as evidence, So typically, when we're looking at research, it has to be a certain level of, it has to look like this, it has to have this. But in reality, when communities are implementing, they have different types of maybe evidence that if you're applying for any funding, they'll ask you, can you touch a piece of evidence on what the work that you've been doing? Do you have a report? Do you have all these specific things? And the reality is that for some of the community-led initiatives or refugee-led organization, that's a reality that we're still working with, even with different donors, right? Whether it's big funding, small funding, as much as it's flexible, there's still that aspect of proving your credibility in terms of what you're doing. And the question that I also encountered when I was doing my advocacy was, how representative are you? Are you speaking about your own issue? Are you speaking about the community issue? Are you speaking up? Who exactly are you speaking for? And the reality is I can't speak for every single person. I'm in this space representing experience of displacement. And the question that would come back to me was, but how representative is this? Which is hypocritical in a sense, because even within the donor conversation, the NGO conversation, advocacy spaces, we want people in the room, but if we have people in the room, we still question them. So as a community, the best thing that we can do as a community, for example, is really redefine what evidence means for us. It can be a piece of music, which is still evidence, but if that is not acceptable within the research space, that's questionable, right? If you want to look at refugee leadership and how it's been documented from the perspective of consultants and other people who've been doing this. Up until recently, we have now many other refugees who are actually documenting what is happening, where they've been, the challenges that they've encountered in terms of access to documentation, traveling to engage in some advocacy forums. And that is evidence in itself. But because it doesn't meet some criteria, it would not be taken in as evidence. So I think when I'm thinking about why we need evidence, that within the community, we need it to help the community itself to produce knowledge and to be acknowledged as knowledge producers. And then secondly, we also need other forms of evidence that can also be taken in, not just the traditional reports. Reports will be there. But in reality, when we're looking at some of the community engagement or community implementation that is happening, people don't have funding to write a very extensive 40-page report. But if they're able to produce a 1 or 5 minute overview of what has happened, then that should be taken in. And then the last one is just for our credibility. How do we say we're doing work in the community? We talk about, yes, we're doing work in our community. We have the lived experience. But if the evidence is coming from our own terms, our own perspective as well with the community, then that also can be acceptable. The other challenge that always comes with this is, well, you're from the community, you're going to be biased, positionality. But the reality is, even for other researchers who are generating evidence, you're also part of a community. So how is it that when people with a displaced background want to generate evidence that support the work that they're doing in their community is there, they're producing it, it's not going to be acceptable. But because someone already has 5 years, 10 years, 15 years of experience, that becomes acceptable. So I think it's almost sort of like rewiring our minds to also say, to actually be bold enough and say, the way we've been approaching this has been from one angle. Let's actually go back to the community and also hear from them. What other forms of evidence exist? Why is it important in their work? And I think it also builds back to evidence not only for the donors, but evidence also for accountability within the community. Because I can't say I've been doing 10 years of advocacy and I have nothing to highlight. What have I been able to do? Or I've been implementing programs for 5 years and I have no data to prove that this is something that I've done. So I think it's both ways, not only for the donors, but also for the community, for accountability purposes, for transparency purposes, and also for collaboration purposes. If I am working on this specific area, then I'm also able to build and to work with these people. So it's hypocritical to some extent, but then it's also needed, particularly within this time where things are shifting and things are moving as well.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that evidence is absolutely needed, mainly in terms of speaking, to the people who still hold power as to the ways in which they should and can change. I guess I think I've shared this in a previous podcast that when you really imagine how humanitarian interventions are envisaged from the perspective of the most marginalized, then really the most important kind of evidence is going to be their own experience of any community activity or collective action. And they're probably always going to be more suspicious of a different form of evidence that doesn't match their own experience. So the most important thing is that in effect, their experience becomes the evidence. And then to me, a lot of any other evidence, and it's either not accessible to the most marginalized, in which case they're not even going to see it, or it could maybe have the risk of not aligning with their own experiences. And therefore, it seems to me like it's mostly quite targeted at other people, the people who hold the power. In other words, it's another form of proving that is serving the status quo of sustaining the agenda from those who have the power as opposed to the shifting of the power. But I fully agree with what you're saying, that this has to be revealed through a language that those with power can understand, which, evidence is a good example. And the work you were doing when you're working in research was definitely along those lines. Was that the case?
Yeah, I think for me, especially when I got myself into research, one of the key things was there's quite a lot of policy, there's a lot of good policies, I'd say. There are quite good policies that have been put together. But then in practice, you find that these policies, implementation is not happening, or the tracking in itself, the accountability aspect of it. And there's quite a lot of research that has been done. Evidence has been generated. I mean, when you look at livelihood as a topic, there's been quite a lot of things that has been said around why it's important, why it needs to happen. There's been quite a lot of hypotheses that has been shown to highlight why livelihood is very important for the community. But then at the same time, I felt, for instance, in Nairobi, we've done all these specific things, but one area or angle that was still, we had not moved a lot on, was on work permits, right? We talk about a lot around livelihood and the change that it would make. So when I was actually engaging in research, that was one area that I ended up looking at. And for me, it was important because I felt when we talk about livelihood, we don't take the conversation to the next level. sort of like get to just a surface level. We dance around the main issue, which is there's no way we'll talk about livelihood, do advocacy for jobs, and we don't highlight the policy. And it was interesting to actually go back into it and look at what are the policies that exist in Kenya in terms of work permit. What does it say? What does it not say? In terms of business, what does it say? What does it not say? And that for me was a moment where I got to actually see that beyond just saying access to education, we need then to talk about the actual thing that is happening, document it, hear perspective from people, and then use that as a point of saying, well, we've talked about access, we want work permit, and we don't want just politically correct answer of, yes, work permit is being given. We want data to show that there's actually accountability that is happening. This number of work permits have been issued. These are the number of people who are able to work. Because we talk about self-reliance for the longest time, but we don't end up promoting dignity of the displaced community just because of a piece of paper that is missing. And it's linked into other intersectional challenges that is being faced. So I feel when I was engaging in research, for me, it was important to have a different lens of what are some of the over-researched topics? What are some of the under-researched topics? Why is this important to the community? Even before implementing the research, going back to the community and saying, this is what we plan to do. This is the area I want to actually go and look at and investigate this. What do you think? And the community is able to say, don't go to this location because that location doesn't have a lot of refugees. Most of us are here in this location, so not only depending on the traditional information that is available, but also pausing before starting research and going back and asking the community, is this a priority? Then they share back. And then coming back to the community, one, to also check the findings, share back with them and say, this is the findings that we found. What do you think? Does it align with what you are thinking? Capturing those information and making sure that it's not just another, yes, we're going to consult. Because I think participation right now, I'd say, is equivalent to consultation. There's just participation. And we're not making progress to collaboration. Collaboration means that we end up acknowledging that we are equal. You bring something, I bring something, then we collaborate and build it. So I think also questioning how we do it and the terminologies that we use in that whole process has been one of the key things for me as I was engaging in research in itself. It's interesting to engage in it, challenging as well, because you encounter different things. But more importantly, someone who has a displacement background, also the ethics of research in itself, right? That for me was also another experience looking at, this is a situational ethics. How do you deal with a situation on the ground that the traditional ethics does not cover, So how do you really work on it and ensure that the quality of your research is not biased, the quality of your research is representing the community perspective, and the quality of your research is going to build into something else. So it's been a learning process, but it also takes a change of and shift of power even within the research community in accepting displaced researchers' work as well.
Foni, thanks so much. We could keep talking. I have so many more questions to ask you, so let's hope we can do this again in maybe in the next series. Been so grateful for everything you shared, and I've learned a lot as well. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you to all the listeners who have joined us today in our Are We Listening podcast.